modern world a world of imagination, action, enterprise? Or was it the culmination of the Middle Ages, which had lasted for nearly 1,000 years? Or was it a bit of both? The Renaissance and the Age of Discovery, this time on the Western tradition.
Now, UCLA Professor Eugen Weber's continuing journey through the history of Western civilization.
I told you a few programs back that the Middle Ages were invented by the Renaissance. But the Renaissance was invented by itself. I don't mean that people in the 14th or 15th century conjured up the word, but they acted as if they might do so at any time, because they felt so excited by what was going on around. Now, part of what was going on was the same old mess as before and after: wars, injustice, violence, misery. What we call the Renaissance, after all, ran from about the 14th century through the 16th. So it overlapped the late Middle Ages for more than 100 years. But there was an important difference. There were serious economic problems, but there was more enterprise, more wealth, more leisure in the Renaissance, and also more competition in the conspicuous consumption that went with wealth and leisure. And one form of consumption that especially soared was culture. Culture which adored and pursued antiquity with an extraordinary urgency and passion. Their literature and architecture and visual arts soared, and their achievements made contemporaries feel that they lived in a time when men were at last on the way to recapture the greatness of the ancients. Those ancients, against whom the West had measured itself for 1,000 years.
If you want to be objective, the West had been reviving since the 12th century at least. The great cathedrals hadn't waited for the 14th century, and previous generations had translated the Greeks, had studied philosophy and the laws of nature, had made technological improvements. In the 13th century, better chimney construction made heating more flexible and thus made privacy possible for the better off. The chimney probably affected the art of love more than the troubadours did, and it fostered more individualism than Renaissance philosophers did. And without another contemporary invention, eyeglasses, we probably would have had fewer philosophers anyway. Among other inventions of the 12th century was the spinning wheel, which not only made yarn cheaper, but also suggested the use of a belt to transmit power. And the wheelbarrow, which cut in half the number of people needed to haul small loads by substituting a wheel for the front man. And even the button, which revolutionized the history of clothing. So the Middle Ages was often innovative and increasingly productive. But what changed most in the 14th century was the mood, perhaps because what was being done was less to the glory of God and more to the glory of man. You can see this in literature, where the rebirth of ancient Latin and ancient Greek revived the Greek belief in man as the measure of all things and introduced subversive notions of a life unencumbered by revealed religion.
It's characteristic that this secularizing spirit was represented by men and sometimes by women who called themselves humanists because they were interested in human nature and human values. To put it differently, they were trying to discover the secret of the good life, the virtuous life. And they thought they could find it not in the centuries just past, where no model seemed to fit their bill, but by looking back at antiquity. If you read Seneca or Cicero, and if you wrote like, then you could hope to become as good, as great as they had been.
So the humanists revived the classics, and they studied and they taught them in the humanities, which were supposed to teach you to be good, that is, virtuous and honorable in private and especially in public. The humanities stressed personal judgment, the worth and possibilities of individuals, man's free will, his superiority over unformed, unpolished nature, his duty to society. And they are at the origins of the classical curriculum, which was going to last into the 20th century. The typical Renaissance humanist was a professional scholar. Today, he would be a professor. Like many professors, a lot of humanists were chiefly interested in splitting hairs or coming out with learned quotes. But also, like some professors, humanists wanted to prepare their students and readers to operate wisely in the world. Ideally, most of these students would be princes or courtiers or men and women who exercised some power around them. Certainly they would have to be educated because they had to know Latin. One of the most famous humanists of the Renaissance was a Dutch monk, Desiderius Erasmus, who lived from 1466 to 1536. When he wasn't editing texts, Erasmus dedicated himself to teaching morals and culture, good manners, common sense, civility, and the Christian virtues, all of which were as signally lacking in his day as they are today. But I prefer one of his Italian contemporaries, Niccolò Machiavelli. Machiavelli was a less erudite man, but more inclined to think for himself, and what this produced you can see if you read his little book, The Prince. Machiavelli has been much condemned as cynical and immoral because his book describes power politics as they are and not as they should be. But Machiavelli had a lot of experience with politics in one of the most politicized cities of the time, Florence. This is the court of Lorenzo the Magnificent, who ruled the city when Machiavelli was growing up there. In the mess that followed Lorenzo's death, Machiavelli learned to consider politics as a jungle where the strong take what they can, the weak go to the wall, and ordinary people fare better under strong rulers than under weak ones.
In a way, Machiavelli simply described what he saw around. More important, though, he separated metaphysics from politics. Religion or morality or law became just another factor of political action, like armies, like taxes. And this was a radical break from medieval tradition. But apart from Machiavelli, and perhaps I should add Thomas More, most humanists have little to say to us today. Their writings are not very readable, they're overstuffed with classical references and quotes. It's much more exciting and much more accessible to trace the new spirit of the Renaissance in the visual arts, which really illustrate the vigor and the excitement of the time and its focus on human possibilities.
You can begin to see the change by contrasting the great mosaics of the 11th and 12th centuries with the work of Giotto, who lived during the late 13th and early 14th centuries in Florence in the early days of the Renaissance. Many of Giotto's contemporaries still created great, majestic, hypnotic figures of authority and power, or else they painted puppet shows in the impersonal Byzantine manner, full of lifeless mannequins in splendid attire. But Giotto's work was affected by the new revival of classical ideals, and especially by the new humanity that St. Francis had brought to religion. Giotto's approach was emotional and urgent. Unlike the stiff manner of the Middle Ages, it expressed a new humanity. So Giotto was innovative, but he was also profoundly Christian and medieval. Characteristically, his best-known paintings can be seen in a chapel in Padua called the Scrovegni Chapel because it was built by the son of a usurer of that name. Old Mr. Scrovegni was so notorious that Dante placed him in one of the circles of hell in the Inferno. So here you have a typical medieval act of redemption. The usurer's son holds out his chapel in a propitiatory gesture to make up for the ill-gotten family wealth. Now, compare this with a picture painted in 1434, 100 years after Giotto's death, Jan van Eyck's portrait of Giovanni Arnolfini and his wife. We are in Bruges, but the subject is an Italian merchant and his young bride. We are in the house of a businessman and a moneylender like Scrovegni, but the couple is presented as if they were nobles, and they make no apologies for their money. And look at the realism and the precision of presentation, which are in keeping with the rationality of a new, more secular society. 50 years go by, and Botticelli is painting his Birth of Venus in Florence around 1485. By this time, spiritual concerns have been drained out. Not from all life, of course, far from it, but from this painting. All Botticelli seems to care about is sensuousness and recreating the ancients. He takes an ancient subject, he tries to paint it as the ancients would have done, and he revels not in spiritual, but in sensuous beauty. Then another 50 years go by, and Michelangelo paints the Last Judgment on the altar wall of the Sistine Chapel, finishing in 1541. It's an overwhelming composition, and the best thing really is just to look at it and gasp. I mention it here because it's so different from any kind of medieval Christian spirit of hierarchy or order. And in the same room, there are also frescoes that Michelangelo painted a quarter century earlier. These are about the creation. And they look to me like a powerful, explosive affirmation of man. So in these two works, the Renaissance has really supplanted the Middle Ages. When he painted The Last Judgment, Michelangelo was an old man in his 60s. Rome had been sacked and pillaged a few years before, and the old sense of unlimited possibilities had started to crack. But the thing that strikes me is that whether in a vision of torment, doubt, defeat, or in a vision of affirmation, you can find here in a Vatican chapel, at the center of Western Christendom, you can find here one of the ongoing themes of the modern Western world. Man is great. He's always in trouble, but he's the most impressive thing we've got. And this is a theme you wouldn't have found 400 years before. This greatness of man was going to be proved and accelerated in another way by the invention of printing from movable type, which occurred in Germany around 1445 and which we attribute to a goldsmith called Gutenberg. By 1480, over 110 European towns had printing shops. And by 1500, about 20 million books had been printed. And the 16th century was going to see at least 10 times more than that. The humanists quickly realized the advantage of cheaper and more numerous books. So did the church. At first, most of the books were for clerks and clerics anyway, and most of them were in Latin, which meant that access to reading was limited. But by the 16th century, this changed. Magistrates, burghers, tradesmen owned books, often in their own language. A publishing industry grew up to cater to more simple people with pious books and entertaining books and almanacs. And chivalric romances of adventure and glory were turned out in vast numbers by Italian and Spanish printers who fed the dreams of future conquistadores. And in fact, during the 15th century and the first half of the 16th, the Renaissance, a period of intense and passionate cultural achievement, was going to coexist with the age of discovery, a period of fervent expansion. Just as there had never been so much variety and creativity in the arts, so too had there never been so much exploration and discovery. When Bartholomew Diaz rounds the Cape of Good Hope in 1487, Botticelli is helping to paint the Sistine Chapel in Rome. In 1506, Columbus dies impoverished, forgotten, still believing he discovered the coast of Asia. And the same year, Bramante begins to build St. Peter's in Rome. In 1513, Balboa crosses the Isthmus of Panama to reveal the existence of the Pacific, and Machiavelli publishes The Prince. Raphael dies in 1520 when Magellan is sailing around the world and a rebellion is gathering in Germany around a monk named Martin Luther, a rebellion which would soon burst into the Reformation. And in the 1530s, while Pizarro is conquering Peru, Erasmus and Rabelais are in full bloom, while Michelangelo is painting his Last Judgment on the altar wall of the Sistine Chapel.
The Renaissance and the Age of Discovery were two peaks of achievement, one of imagination, the other of action. But did they have anything in common? Is it possible to say that Erasmus wrote and Raphael painted and Bartholomew Diaz ventured past the Cape of Storms in obedience to a similar impulse? And was this impulse derived from some common experience, a way of thinking, an approach to living that historians have agreed to call the European Renaissance? Did the urge to discover new lands grow from the intellectual ferment of the Renaissance? And what effect did the broadening of geographical horizons have on the mental horizons of the people at home?
The first thing we can say is that human nature did not change, but the scope of human aspirations was increased by greater material possibilities. By the 1480s and 90s, Europe had developed an agricultural base, an industrial capacity, a superiority in arms, and a skill in sailing the oceans that enabled it to explore the rest of the globe, to conquer and loot and colonize it for the next 4 centuries in a way that the greediest ancient Roman would have envied. Many of the material things that made this exploration possible, however, came out of the Middle Ages. The magnetic compass was adopted by 1187. Sea charts and pilot books were available after 1280. And the ships and the guns that explorers used were not developed by Renaissance intellectuals, but by craftsmen. And just as the means of exploration developed out of the Middle Ages, so did the motives behind it. This is the reception of Columbus by Ferdinand and Isabella. They and other rulers were interested in gold and silver to supplement dwindling sources at home, and in slaves, and in spices from the East, which were necessary in the first place to preserve food, which spoiled fast in the ages before refrigeration, and then quite simply to make lousy food eatable, tough and stringy meat from skinny cattle, tasteless vegetables, unappetizing and often spoiled food in general. But this spice trade was threatened by the advance of a new Muslim power, the Turks, who took Constantinople in 1453, and the Balkans as well, thus upsetting the commercial balance of the Mediterranean. Before that, Italy had enjoyed a near monopoly of the spice trade for several centuries, which was the source of much of its prosperity. So the countries of Western Europe sought to outflank the Turks and the Italians as well. France, Spain, Portugal, England, and the Netherlands all saw the possibilities of sailing south or sailing west to reach the East Indies, and they had the means to do it. Another motive, universally expressed and quite widely believed, was the desire to extend Christianity. And here too, the age of discovery did not see something new, but the redirection of an earlier medieval motive, which had linked conquest and gain with missionary enthusiasm in the Crusades, which Europe had sent out since the 11th century. This crusading ideal had declined precipitously, but it was revived by the advance of the Turks in the southern and eastern Mediterranean and by the fall of Constantinople. And it was maintained by the war against the Moors in Spain, which only ended significantly in 1492, at which point the Spanish crown finally gave Columbus permission to sail.
The most Renaissance aspect of discovery lay in the cooperation between the crown, geographical experts, and highly educated merchants out for profit, but also very curious and increasingly well-informed. And we can find aspects of a new mentality among seamen and travelers as well. We find it in a Venetian called Cadamosto, who said that he joined the Portuguese sailing down the African coast in 1455 and 1456 in order to see interesting sights. And we find it in another Italian, Antonio Pigafetta, who joined Magellan's expedition 60 years later to experiment, he said, and go and see with my own eyes a part of those things we have heard so much about. And finally, we find it in the great explorers themselves, who were not just leaders and seamen, but who had to visualize their undertaking within the context of an emerging knowledge of the world as a whole, testing the hypotheses of medieval geography and developing them into a new science altogether, as we shall see in our next program.
Hello, I am Dr. David Simmons. In this segment of Western Arts and Ideas, I will lead you into the consideration of the philosophical concerns of Renaissance literature. Although scholars disagree, many look to 15th century Florence for the earliest signs of a Renaissance in literature. During the 15th century in Florence, the Medici family commissioned philosophers and authors to translate and interpret Neoplatonic texts. Cosimo de' Medici gathered scholars together in a Platonic academy for the study of classical texts. These scholars made it their mission to study classical languages, literature, and philosophy, and to propagate the aesthetic values of classical culture in their works. In this introduction to Renaissance literature, I will refer to classical culture, classical humanism, Platonic idealism, Aristotelian realism, humanities, liberal arts, human perfectibility, and the doctrine of original sin. Because these terms are significant for the following discussion of Renaissance literature, I would like to begin by defining these terms. Behind me, you see the interior of Brunelleschi's Pazzi Chapel. This chapel was designed with harmonic ratios in mind. Brunelleschi held notion that music and beauty could be mathematically defined, particularly as represented in the circle and square. This idea of beauty was derived from classical culture. When I refer to classical culture, I mean the cultures of Greece and Rome. These are considered classical because among Western societies, they represent the best aspects of human endeavor, have permanent significance, and define what has been considered beautiful by past ages. In literature specifically, classical denotes clarity, restraint, and rationality. Such renowned philosophers as Protagoras and Socrates, Plato and Aristotle thrived during the golden age of Greece from approximately 500 BC through 400 BC. At the same time, some of the greatest dramatists of all time, such as Sophocles and Aeschylus, Euripides and Aristophanes, were writing for Greek audiences. Regarding the potential of humanity, this period in Western history was the most optimistic. Their thoughts and writings were the fountain from which classical humanism flowed. Protagoras, one of the principal exponents of classical humanism, coined the phrase, "Man is the measure of all things." An echo of Protagoras' refrain could be heard when Sophocles claimed, "Many are the wonders of the world, and none so wonderful as man." Likewise, Renaissance thinkers held that humanity defined perfection, or is at least capable of attaining perfection. For instance, Leonardo's Vitruvius Man illustrates the concept that the human form is perfect in its proportions. Two great philosophies still debated today came out of ancient Greece. These are the philosophies of Plato and Aristotle. Plato is known as the founder of idealism. Platonic idealism is the philosophy which proposes that the greatest reality is in the realm of the ideal. An ideal is infinite, perfect, and universal, and by definition exists apart from physical reality. In contrast, Aristotle believed that all about which we may be certain is physical reality. He did not dispute that ideas are real, but only proposed that form and matter are inseparable, and that experience of the physical precedes any other knowledge. Therefore, Aristotelian realism emphasizes the causal relationship of material processes. When the sun set on Greek culture, a new day was already dawning as Rome rose in prominence. The Romans were a practical people who excelled in practical arts. Roman culture produced significant and permanent developments in the fields of law, politics, and architecture. Yet they admired the Greeks for their dedication to intellectual pursuits and aesthetic creations, including literature, philosophy, and the visual arts, which the Romans referred to collectively as the humanities. When studies in the humanities were expanded to include grammar, rhetoric, logic, arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy, they came to be considered the 7 standard disciplines of a liberal arts education. In his own time and throughout the history of Western civilization, St. Augustine has been considered an important Roman. He fortified the concept of original sin with philosophical reasoning. The doctrine of original sin, as developed by Augustine, explains how, due to the sinfulness of Adam and Eve, all the children of the earth are born in sin. Augustine held that this doctrine was consistent with the Neoplatonic concept that the body, due to its imperfections and limitations, is like a prison to the immortal soul. However, some Neoplatonists interpreted Plato's belief that the soul existed in the realm of the ideal prior to its incarnation as reason enough to believe that human nature is inherently good and has the potential to attain perfection. Contrary to their expression of classical humanism, Augustine condemned as sinful the imperfections and limitations of the body which the Neoplatonists perceived as amoral. Please keep the definition of these terms in mind as I continue to explain Renaissance literature from its origins in the 15th century until its culmination in the 16th. Among the Medici circle, Leon Battista Alberti earned a reputation as a Florentine humanist, author, architect, and a leading philosopher of his time whose poems, plays, and essays promoted classical culture. He specifically encouraged artists to develop a repertoire of bodily gestures and facial expressions to depict the human condition. Alberti even suggested a mathematical method for creating the illusion of depth in painting. More than this, in his essay on painting, Alberti expressed the radical opinion that painting is as important to the training of youth as any of the other liberal arts. Alberti cited classical culture as his authority. Roman citizens taught their sons painting along with the fine arts and the art of living piously and well. This excellent custom was frequently observed among the Greeks, who, because they wished their sons to be well educated, taught them painting along with geometry and music. It was also an honor among women to know how to paint. Since these things are so, since painting is the best and most ancient ornament of things, worthy of free men, pleasing to learned and unlearned, Alberti concluded, I greatly encourage our studious youth to exert themselves as much as possible in painting. Pico della Mirandola was another who associated with the scholars of Cosimo de' Medici's Platonic Academy. In his oration on the dignity of man, citing Abdul the Saracen, Mirandola claimed, there is nothing more wonderful to be seen than man. Mirandola could have been paraphrasing Protagoras or Sophocles just as well. Mirandola believed that if humanity were not perfect, individuals at least had the ability to improve themselves. His positive view of humanity was based on the Neoplatonic concept that the soul proceeds from the realm of ideal forms. This assumption contradicted the Christian doctrine of original sin, but in a renewed attempt at synthesizing Christian theology and Platonic philosophy, the scales tipped toward classical humanism. Mirandola set his mind on the high ideal that individuals, properly tutored, could attain perfection in the social graces, even become godlike. As Mirandola wrote in the Oration on the Dignity of Man, if you come upon a pure contemplator, ignorant of the body, banished to the innermost places of the mind, he is not an earthly, not a heavenly animal, he is more superbly a divinity clothed with human flesh. In the book of the Courtier, Baldassare Castiglione began with the humanist assumption that perfection was attainable, and then contemplated what skills and abilities were desirable in a young courtier. By dramatizing discussions in which he had participated while serving the Duke of Urbino, and in the presence of the Duchess Elisabetta Gonzaga, Castiglione presented the views of members of courtly society. The aesthetic values that predominate in this dialogue are received from classical culture. The Book of the Courtier exhibits many of the characteristics of classical humanism and idealism. The participants in the discussions dramatized by Castiglione argued that a young man should be skilled in the arts of war as well as the liberal arts. Striving for perfection, the young courtier should study literature and art without neglecting training in the use of weapons. The perfect courtier should be a more than average scholar, at least in those studies which we call the humanities. In addition, the virtues of the young man include that he would be fierce, rough, and always to the fore in the presence of the enemy. But anywhere else, he should be kind, modest, reticent, and anxious above all to avoid ostentation. Nonetheless, his humility should not be allowed to hinder his reputation or cheat him of the fame that is the true reward of worthy effort. As with every effort, or every point made in the dialogue, the courtier's claim to fame was justified by classical authority. Thus, among the ancient authors, whoever carries weight seldom fails to praise himself. Castiglione was a progressive thinker for his time, as his attitude toward the education and role of women in society revealed. The social graces of a young woman include to be knowledgeable about literature and painting, and the ability to give a good impression of herself to the other principles that have been taught the courtier. Although his agenda did not contribute significantly to women's involvement in contemporary society, Castiglione's curriculum for women opened up new avenues into the future. As he anticipated in his dialogue, his readers would be mildly shocked. But with confidence in the classical tradition to which he ascribed, Castiglione responded, "Do you not know that Plato, who was certainly no great friend of women, put them in charge of the city and gave all the military duties to the men?" By way of contrast, the prince, Niccolò Machiavelli, seems to suggest that the high ideals of the Renaissance humanists had been cast before swine. Contrary to the idealism of Castiglione and Mirandola, Machiavelli declared that men are ambitious, greedy, gullible, selfish, and weak. One might believe that Machiavelli adhered to the Christian doctrine of original sin, except for the fact that he advised the prince to act in a manner condemned by Christian teaching. In a phrase, Machiavelli's advice to the would-be prince was to practice to deceive. The masses are so gullible, Machiavelli intimated, that any means will be excused if it produces the desired result. In other words, the end justifies any means. According to Machiavelli, to govern well, the prince must appear to be virtuous, although his actions are immoral. For instance, Machiavelli justified cruelty if used well. We can say that cruelty is used well if it is permissible to talk in this way of what is evil, when it is employed once for all, and one's safety depends on it. Then it is not persisted in, but as far as possible turned to the good of one's subjects. Machiavelli's insistence that by this method the prince will gain instant success was and is a controversial idea. The fact that it was banned by the Pope did not prevent many people from reading it secretly. Finally, Machiavelli's prince can be seen as anti-classical and mannerist because he took an unusually pessimistic view of humanity and recommended behavior which was inconsistent with the idealism of Renaissance humanism. When we consider the Renaissance beyond Italy, the most prominent figure is Desiderius Erasmus. Erasmus, often called the Prince of Humanists, was a leading Christian humanist who combined studies of classical texts with concern for church reform. Although his life's work was collecting Greek manuscripts and translating the New Testament scriptures, his most famous work was The Praise of Folly. The Praise of Folly demonstrates that Erasmus thought change could be brought about through humor. He felt the audience would laugh with him because they lived in an upside-down world where wisdom and virtue are treated as if insignificant. In order to speak freely, Erasmus used personification, a literary device whereby an author gives personality to an idea. Erasmus turned the classical tradition on its ear by choosing Dame Folly to represent his criticisms. Folly began her self-praise by claiming her father was Plutus, despite the opinion of Hesiod, Homer, and Jove himself. Folly explained that Plutus was the god of wealth and abundance, who turns everything sacred and profane upside down. Thus, itinerant monks made a good living through their uncleanness and beggary by bellowing their petitions for food from door to door, claiming all the while to be setting an apostolic example. Furthermore, Folly pitied scholars like Erasmus because when they write learnedly to be criticized by a few scholars, they seem to be more pitiable than happy, simply because they are continuously torturing themselves with additions and revisions. Folly credited herself for the happiness of the author who, without any hesitation, rapidly writes down anything that comes to mind, confident that fools and ignoramuses will approve of them. When these authors praise themselves or their peers, she said, one holds another in higher esteem than Cicero, the other finds one more learned than Plato. And Folly proclaimed, our authors are leading a luxurious life because of my excellence. By these statements, Erasmus did not mean to reject the classical tradition or the great humanists of his own era. But his criticisms were directed toward reforms in every social sphere and called for a return to a simple and humble Christianity. Of Renaissance literary works, none are more lively than Rabelais' Gargantua and Pantagruel. These books have been described as mocking, farcical, sensual, even crude. On the other hand, no other works are more rational and optimistic. Rabelais certainly threw off classical restraint and behavior of bawdy comedy, but in so doing, he created entertaining and sophisticated satires. Underlying his ridicule of human folly is his faith in the innate goodness of humanity. This is especially apparent at the end of Book 1, regarding the Abbey of Theleme. The Abbey of Theleme is a unique monastery built by Gargantua for Friar John of the Funnels. The principle which governs its design and daily routines is that the behaviors and rules expected at other monasteries will not pertain to the Abbey of Theleme. If other abbeys were surrounded by walls, then Theleme would have none. If in other abbeys the ground trod by lay pilgrims had to be swept, then at Theleme, where the religious and clergy walked, would be purified instead. This humorous reversal of religious observance was considered appropriate for the monks and nuns of Theleme. Hypocrites and bigots, loan sharks and lawsuit-chasing crimps were warned to stay away, but noble gentlemen and scholars who expounded Holy Writ, ladies of beauty, charm, and virtue were invited in. For such as these, only one rule was necessary.
In their rules, there was only one clause: do what you will, because people who are free, well-born, well-bred, and easy in honest company have a natural spur and instinct which drives them to virtuous deeds and deflects them from vice. And this they called honor.
What some critics called the Abbey's unchristian rule was based on humanist morals. Rabelais' monks and nuns were educated just as Castiglione's courtiers.
So nobly were they instructed that there was not a man or woman among them who could not read, write, sing, play musical instruments, speak 5 or 6 languages, and compose in them both verse and prose. Never were seen such worthy knights, so valiant, so nimble, both on foot and horse. Knights more vigorous, more agile, hardier with all weapons than they were. Never were seen ladies so good-looking, so dainty, less tiresome, more skilled with the fingers and the needle, and in every free and honest womanly pursuit than they were.
Here in the Abbey of Theleme, Rabelais presented a utopian vision drawn from the same inspiration as found in Castiglione's Book of the Courtier and Thomas More's Utopia. This tradition of utopian literature includes such classical authors as Homer, who named the perfect place the Elysian Fields, and St. Augustine, who called it the Heavenly City. Literary critics suggest that Thomas More's Utopia may have been inspired by Plato's Republic as well. It is an example of Christian humanism in literature which drew inspiration and guidance from both classical texts and the Bible. Like Erasmus, Thomas More was a Christian humanist who hoped to reform society, and as Castiglione presented an ideal courtier for a role model, More presented the ideal society as a model for social change. In Utopia, private ownership was not allowed. Therefore, Thomas More claimed that greed, ambition, and discontent had been eradicated because through collection and redistribution of public resources, everyone had their needs met and no one had more than another. Daily labor, free medical care, free education, and communal meals were all guaranteed. There was no persecution on the basis of religion, and for the most part, the laws were simple. Although the people of Utopia considered nothing so inglorious as the glory won in war, nonetheless, as Castiglione's courtiers, they regularly practiced military exercises on certain days so that they will be prepared when the need arises. Of the Renaissance works considered thus far, Castiglione's Book of the Courtier and More's Utopia were the most humanistic and idealistic. In contrast, Machiavelli's Prince and Rabelais' Gargantua and Pantagruel exhibited characteristics of mannerism. With this comparison in mind, it is interesting to note that significant elements of William Shakespeare's Hamlet subverts the classical literary standards of clarity, restraint, and rationality. Instead, Shakespeare's Hamlet clearly illustrates the characteristics of manneristic literature. For example, instead of a clear narrative line, Shakespeare presented a perplexing problem which complicates the plot. When the ghost of his father appears to divulge the secret of his murder, Hamlet cannot be sure whether the ghost is a messenger of truth or a lying demon. Let's watch Hamlet's response as directed by Zeffirelli and played by Mel Gibson.
Look, my lord. It comes. Angels and ministers of grace defend us.
Be thou a spirit of health or goblin damned. Bring with thee airs from heaven or blasts from hell. Be thy intents wicked or charitable, I will speak to thee. I'll call thee Hamlet. King. Father. Royal Danes. Oh, answer me.
Hamlet swears to remember and act on the ghost's report. But what if the ghost is some messenger from hell who seeks to deceive Hamlet and cause him to kill an innocent man? How can Hamlet be sure that his uncle killed his father, as the ghost said? In his psychological turmoil over avenging his father's murder, Hamlet stumbles upon a way to test the ghost's story.
That guilty creatures sitting at a play have by the very cunning of the scene been struck so to the soul that presently they have proclaimed their malefactions. I'll have these players play something like the murder of my father before mine uncle. I'll observe his looks, I'll tempt him to the quick. If he do blanch, I know my cause. The spirit that I have seen may be a devil, and the devil have power to assume a pleasing shape, yea, and perhaps out of my weakness and my melancholy, as he is very potent with such spirits, abuses me to damn me. I'll have grounds more relative than this. The play's the thing, wherein I'll catch the conscience of the king.
Well, here we see Shakespeare's characteristic play within the play as a device to resolve Hamlet's problem and remove the obstacle which has impeded the play's action. This complication of the plot is one reason why Shakespeare's Hamlet may be considered mannerist. Another way Shakespeare gave a mannerist twist to his play was to highlight Hamlet's emotional outbursts. When the time has passed without Hamlet taking his revenge, he begins to hate his own cowardice.
Am I a coward? Swans, it cannot be, but I am pigeon-livered and lack gall to make oppression bitter. Or ere this, I should have thatched all the region kites with this slave's offal. Bloody, bawdy villain! Remorseless, treacherous, lecherous, kindless villain! Oh, vengeance!
Why, what an ass am I? This is most brave. That I, the son of a dear father, murdered, prompted to my revenge by heaven and hell, must, like a whore, unpack my heart with words.
I fall a-cussing like a very drab, a scullion. Fuck!
The point is that Hamlet does not display the restraint and classical calm admired by Renaissance humanists, nor does he express the idealism of classical humanism. Instead, he exhibits self-loathing and despair. Finally, madness is as characteristic of Shakespeare's Hamlet as rationality is characteristic of Castiglione's Book of the Courtier. Hamlet feigns madness for a good reason, but because of the madness all around her, Ophelia actually goes insane.
How do you, pretty lady?
Well, God is with you. They say the owl was a baker's daughter. Lord, we know what we are, but not what we may be. I hope all will be well. We must be patient. But I cannot choose but weep. I think they would lay him in a gold crown.
Laertes, Ophelia's brother, returns from college to set things right, but in vain. Not until the coming of Fortinbras, the Prince of Norway, is order restored in Denmark. This last point highlights the fact that Hamlet's moral dilemma diverts our attention away from the primary question of who will be king of Denmark. The problem began when Hamlet's father conquered Norway and killed its king. Fortinbras, the angry Prince of Norway, swore to get revenge. Then after Hamlet's father died, Hamlet could have been elected by the people of Denmark, but his uncle Claudius intruded on his ascent to the throne by marrying Hamlet's mother, Gertrude. This is the background of Shakespeare's Hamlet. The play opens with guards watching for the approach of Norway's armies and courtiers arriving to attend the wedding feast of Claudius and Gertrude. In the middle of the play, a letter received from Fortinbras informs Claudius that Norway has conquered Poland. By this same letter, Fortinbras requests an audience with Claudius. Then, at the end of the play, after Gertrude has drunk poison meant for Hamlet, after Laertes has been poisoned by his own sword, after Hamlet has stabbed Claudius to death, and as Hamlet himself lays dying of his wound, he asks Horatio to welcome Fortinbras as the next king of Denmark. I like to explain this manneristic aspect of Shakespeare's Hamlet by comparing it with Leonardo da Vinci's Last Supper and Tintoretto's Last Supper. In Leonardo's Last Supper, the lines of perspective vanish behind the head of Christ. All the elements in the painting direct our attention to the center, where we see Jesus serving his disciples. Overall, this painting demonstrates the classical emphasis on simplicity and balance. On the other hand, Tintoretto's Last Supper shows how artists in the era of mannerism represented their subjects from an unusual perspective. Near the center of the painting, Jesus is serving the disciples. However, our eyes are led across the canvas by lines of perspective cutting from the lower left to the top right, not vanishing in the center behind the main subject. Moreover, our attention is diverted by unusual characters in the actions which are represented all around the room. We see a cat playing at the bottom of the painting, and angels swirling in the top of the painting. Likewise, Shakespeare used an odd perspective to show Hamlet wrestling with his personal problem in the middle of a national crisis, with plots and intrigues swirling all around him. This is a suitable point for us to break from our consideration of philosophic concerns represented in Renaissance literature. We have seen how classical culture influenced Renaissance humanism, and we've come to the point where classical values were being revived and or rejected by mannerism. Next time, we will examine the literature of the Baroque age and find that classical culture continued to have an influence.